Hey, it's Carrie Kenner, and welcome to the weekly vlog. I was having a conversation last week with a doula who was talking about the frustrations of an induction, a labor induction that one of her clients had recently had. And I thought, oh, this is a topic that so many doulas struggle with. So it's going to be the topic for this week's vlog. So let's start out with the basics. What is an induction? So labor, it normally starts on its own, and it's caused by hormones that start circulating in the pregnant person's body, and it triggers a number of different biological actions that cause the uterus to start contracting and eventually lead to the birth of the baby. And sometimes labor doesn't appear to want to start on its own. And sometimes there's reasons that an induction might be necessary. So the labor is started artificially. And I'll talk a little bit later about how it started artificially. But what it basically means is that something is going to be done to the person's body to cause their uterus to start contracting, to cause their cervix to start opening, and to kind of kickstart the birth process. Now, that sounds maybe easy, maybe not easy enough. But here's the thing. If the body isn't going into labor on its own, it's often because it's not ready, or there's a reason why it's not going into labor on its own. So for that reason, inductions aren't always successful. And I think of it similar to trying to force an avocado to ripen. Okay, now we've all been there. We're getting ready to have our chips and salsa, and boy, that guacamole would be good as well. But the rock hard avocado is sitting on the counter. So if you're like me, you Google, how do you get an avocado to ripen fast? And you learn something like I did once, like putting it in the oven. And what you end up with is an awful, warm, brown, funky tasting avocado. Like it doesn't work. Now, maybe if the avocado was close to being ripe and it just needed a little nudge, and inductions for people who are close to going into labor and just need a little nudge, they tend to work okay. But otherwise, you just end up with a really funky thing that doesn't work very well. So that's my analogy of avocados and labor inductions. So why are labors induced? Hopefully for a medical reason. In other words, the pregnant person has a medical condition that means that it would be better, safer, healthier for them to not be pregnant anymore. And the most common medical condition is preeclampsia, which is the blood pressure is rising and it's starting to affect some of the important organs in the body. And so preeclampsia is a pretty dangerous condition. It's good to not be pregnant anymore. Another medical condition might be the well-being of the baby. So sometimes towards the end of pregnancy, babies don't seem to be growing as well, or they don't seem to be getting enough oxygen. And these can come from situations like the placenta is starting to kind of tire out and not work as well. Enough blood flow isn't getting to the baby. There's a couple of different things. But so if the baby is not doing well, it might be better for the baby to get help on the outside instead of staying inside and not getting everything that it needs. So those are the main reasons that labor should be induced. But the most common reason that labor is induced has to do with one's due date. So if somebody is at 40 weeks pregnancy, which is considered one's due date, and they haven't had their baby, nowadays most people are encouraged to have their labor induced. Why? Well, there's some research that says that as babies go past the 40-week mark, they may have more problems getting out, like they might get bigger. And there might be more incidents of problems with the baby, and in the worst case, stillbirth. That's where the baby dies before it's born. The incidence of that is really small, like percentages of percentages. But nobody wants to be in the category that it happens to, so people often get a little bit nervous, and their care provider suggests that they get induced at 40 weeks, and even if they didn't want induction, they kind of go along with it. But it's not just 40 weeks. Sometimes people's doctors recommend that they get induced at 39 weeks or 38 weeks or sometimes even 37 weeks. And again, there might be a medical condition that's contributing to this recommendation, but often it's really more about you're getting towards the end of your pregnancy, your baby should be fine, let's induce labor and get this going. Now, many people have heard about situations where their inductions are done for convenience, like somebody's doctor is going to be out of town and the doctor wants to be there. So they're like, let's just schedule you for an induction this week before I go on vacation. Or the pregnant person wants to have the induction because they're really tired of being pregnant, or their mother or helper is going to be in town for a limited period of time and they want to have that person be around when the baby is born. So they don't want to wait and see if the baby comes late and then not have that help for as long. And that all makes sense. But one of the things that's really important for everyone to do, birthing people, care providers, and doulas alike, is to weigh the pros and cons, to balance out the risks of having an induction with the benefits of having an induction. So let's talk about some of the risks. So as I mentioned with my avocado example, a lot of times inductions don't work. It's just you can't force the body to go into labor if it's not ready. Now, you can force kind of the uterus to contract. There are a lot of different factors that go into how successful the medication that causes the uterus to contract will be. But if it's close to the end of pregnancy, this medication usually does a good job of causing the uterus to contract. But if the baby's not ready, or the baby's not in a great position, there's other factors. Even though the uterus is contracting, the labor may still not progress well. And there's also situations where if labor is kind of being forced upon the baby may go into distress. It's really not ready for it. It's really not the optimal time. So sometimes inductions aren't successful, and sometimes they actually cause problems. And one of the other things is that an induction is a really medical event. There's IVs, there's monitors, there's lots more medical stuff that needs to happen to keep the induction safe. And there's also more things that are often done to keep the induction going. So there might be more things done to try to help the labor, but that also might be kind of more like interventions, and that can cause more complications. So there's been a number of studies done on the potential complications. And one of the things that can happen when complications occur is that there's a higher likelihood of a cesarean birth or a C-section, which is a major surgical procedure. And with it comes a whole bunch of risks. So there's been a lot of research done on the safety and efficacy of inductions. And there's been lots of studies. And one of the recent studies was done in 2019. It's called the ARRIVE study. And they looked at inductions at 39 weeks. They compared a group of people who had their labors induced and a group of people who didn't. And they looked at the outcomes. They looked at the outcomes in terms of medical interventions and more complications, but also how well the babies were doing afterwards. And what they found is that there was a slight decrease in the number of cesareans done when the people were induced at 39 weeks. And there was a slight reduction in stillbirths for babies that were induced at 39 weeks. But there was also a way that the study was done that didn't quite compare all the people or all the situations that were happening in the group that weren't induced. So in other words, there was people in the group that weren't induced that may have had medical complications come up, and those weren't kind of counted for. So they were still in that group, but they could have had, lesser outcomes because of these complications that came up after they might have been induced if they were in the induction group. So hope that makes sense. But there's been a lot of research on inductions, and for the most part, it shows that there's definitely an increase in medical intervention. There's, in a lot of the studies, an increase in the cesarean rate. And there's a lot of dissatisfaction for people who've had inductions, primarily because they really didn't know what to expect. And that's what I want to talk about next. So when my clients would come to me either with questions about induction or because their care provider had suggested an induction, there's a lot of things to think about. The first one I always thought about is, do they know what this is? I'm sure they haven't looked at the studies, but do they even know what's involved in having their labor induced? Do they know the potential risks? Has their care provider explained any of this to them? I would balance that information out with what I know that my clients wanted in their birth. What were their desires? What are their hopes? What were their fears? And that needed to be factored in for every individual couple. The ideas about inductions were going to be different. I always hoped that there was a real medical condition that was existing if somebody's care provider was recommending that they have an induction. And I really wanted them to just have full information so that they could give consent and know what was going to be happening to them and their baby before they started this process. So that's what I wanted for my clients. But then there was like what this was going to be like for me. Inductions are really challenging for doulas. And here's why. Inductions are usually long. They usually take at least 24 hours. And sometimes the first 24 hours is just getting things started. It's almost like telling the body, hint, hint, we're going to try to get labor going, hint, hint, and like giving these hints for 24 hours with medications and different things that are done to try to get the body nudged into labor. So people could be in the hospital for 2 days before they have their baby. That's not what they were expecting. And so usually it was me, the doula, breaking that news to them. I'd often ask people, well, what do you think an induction is like? And they're like, oh, they told us to show up at the hospital at 7 a.m. and we'll have our baby by 7 p.m. It's going to be awesome. And it's like, not exactly, depending on what their body was already doing, what we often talked about, like what their cervix was like, is how long it may take to get the cervix prepared for even the medication that would then cause the uterus to contract. At this point, when I'm working with my clients, I would be like, there's so much that they don't know and so much that they haven't been told. It would be kind of awkward for me to have to be the one to break this news to them that they could be in the hospital for days. And it could be really long and tiring. And it's an emotional game and a mental game as much as it is a physical one. And the other thing is that what their birth is going to look like may be a lot different from what they planned. There's going to be a lot more restrictions on what they're going to be able to do because of the medication and the medical equipment that they're going to be hooked up to. It's going to be a lot more limiting for what I can do to support them. And the reality is that if their labor is 2 days long, I can't be there for 2 days. So breaking the news to them that I may not be there for the beginning part, or I may have to have a backup doula come in to give me a break. All these things were just a part of the emotional relationship that we had developed with clients that was getting tested. So over the years, I developed some ways to help make that conversation less awkward and make inductions more successful for all of us. And so it kind of looked like this. The first thing is prevention. So in prenatal visits that I would have with my clients during their pregnancy, I would ask them, had they heard about induction? Had their care provider ever mentioned an induction? What information would be helpful for them if they found out that they needed their labor to be induced at some point in their labor? And whatever came up for them, I would answer in that moment. Now, a lot of people had no questions, no interest, and no idea that this could happen for them. So I wouldn't force this information on them, but I'm planting a seed by saying, hey, there's this thing called induction that could happen to you. Do you want to know about it now? Okay, so planting the seed was the most important part. More likely, I would get a phone call that said, hey, I saw my doctor or my midwife today, and they're recommending an induction. And so then there was kind of a series of questions that I asked. Why is the induction being recommended? How do you feel about it? So I want to find out where they are. They might be like, yay, hallelujah, this is great news. And it's like, great, okay, now we're going to plan for the best induction possible. But oftentimes they'd be like, I wasn't expecting this. I'm scared. I've heard these terrible things. And I'm like, okay, let's talk. And we would have a pretty long conversation where I'd find out all the things that they knew about induction, find out if what they'd heard is remotely realistic. And if not, I would ask them, would you like me to tell you what I know about inductions? So this is an important part of being a doula is whenever we're offering information, especially potentially a lot of information, especially around something that might feel emotionally charged, we want to ask for their consent. So I would ask, would you like me to share what I know? Or are there specific things that you want to know? And I'd let them kind of steer the conversation. The things that I felt were essential for people to know is that it takes a long time and that it may look different than what you expected. So even if they really don't want a lot of information, I would frame that conversation in terms of my role and what they could expect from me. So even if they didn't want to know anything about an induction, even if they said, my doc told me to show up in the hospital at 7 a.m., I'm going to be there. I'm going to say, okay, so here's what my role is going to look like for you. And through the explanation of my role, I could tell them a little bit about the induction process and what to expect. So they're going to have you show up at the hospital at 7. And normally you'd be going to the hospital when you're in labor. And so I would be joining you at that time. But because you're going to the hospital and you're not in labor, I won't be joining you until you're in active labor, until your contractions are starting, just like I would join you at home. Now, you might feel pretty nervous when you're going in, and there might be a lot of, kind of questions and uncertainty that you might have. So I can show up for you in the morning and be there for the first hour or two, just to be there for emotional support. You're not going to be going through anything uncomfortable to need physical support, and kind of get you settled in and, be there while all the process is getting started. So if that sounds useful to you, then I can show up, but then I'm going to leave because I'm not going to be there until you're having contractions and you need my support for labor. So the important thing is I have set an expectation, and I really didn't ask for their permission. I didn't ask what they thought about it. The only thing I asked is whether they wanted me to be there for those first few hours. And I let them know, then I'm leaving and I'm not coming back until you're in labor. I would offer to call and check in throughout the time, but I'm setting a very clear expectation. And I would basically say, it's like, okay, this is how it works. This is how it's going to go. And I do it in a very loving way, but also a very firm way, because I'm setting boundaries so that I can provide good labor support when they're actually having contractions. I would explain those things, find out if they have any questions, any concerns, anything that they are particularly wanting me to do. And then when we're kind of finished with the call, I hang up and I let it go. I might be really frustrated that they didn't want information that I thought would be helpful. I might be frustrated because I know that they're setting themselves up for a birth that they really hadn't planned on. I might be frustrated because they really wanted me to come and stay for a long time and I had to tell them no. There's a lot of emotions that might come up for me, but to protect myself, I have to get off that call and say, I did the best that I could and let it go, because there's still so much of the story left to unfold. The next thing would be being at this induction, knowing that it could be long. So there's a couple of tips that I teach and that I use for myself to create the best induction experience possible. The first one is arriving at the birth space and checking out the ambience. What's going on in this room? Would they be laboring like this if their labor had started on its own? Or is it really not a good, conducive atmosphere for labor? Because the thing is that labor is reliant on a number of hormones. And those hormones do really well in certain situations, and they really don't do well in other situations. And a lot of times what I would see at an induction is that if there's a lot of medical intervention, a lot of medical staff coming and going, the lights are on, there's wires everywhere, that people wouldn't even try to get in the mood for labor. And hint, the mood for labor is very similar to the mood for lovemaking. So that is not the environment that most people would think would be a great time to make a baby. So I would come in and check things out and try to kind of redirect the atmosphere, turn down the lights, put on some music, get people chilled out, not try to get people kissing and hugging, or maybe, but mainly just try to make it a more soothing, relaxing, loving environment and not so medical feeling. And I would have thought about pacing myself. So when this induction business started, I would have done my best to get rest, be well fed, get some exercise, so that when I show up at the birth, I'm the best that I can be. But also, I would have made a call to my backup doula. And I would have said, hey, I've got an induction happening and I may need some relief. So I would make sure that I've got a backup doula who knows that I'm going into an induction and that they may be called in to give me a break. And that break, depending on all the factors that go into a birth, might consist of coming in for a few hours after I've been there for a long time to take a nap. It might depend on the time of day or night that I was called into this birth and how well prepared I was for it, if I was able to do those things before going to this birth. It might be coming to take over for me after I've been at the birth for 12, 18, 24 hours. Depends on, again, what kind of condition I was going into the labor. So I've taken care of myself. And the thing is when you know that you have a backup doula that's ready to give you a break, that can keep you going a little bit longer. And if you're a backup doula for somebody who's doing an induction, knowing that if you get called in, it's going to be for a limited time, that can also make it way easier to show up at a birth because you know you're not going to be there for days. And another really important thing to consider is your openness to whatever needs to happen at that birth. So again, your clients may have wanted less interventions than they're experiencing. You may have been of the mindset that I really want to support them in having, as low of an intervention birth as possible. But when an induction is happening, you kind of want to embrace as many things that are as needed to keep that labor going. We call this active management. And the thing is that inductions are the most successful when you can keep the labor going. And so that might mean choosing to do things that were otherwise on people's kind of I want to avoid list, because the goal is keep the labor progressing and moving as smoothly as possible to prevent a cesarean. That's the best way to prevent a cesarean in a labor induction. And finally, remember, it's the birth of a baby. It's the birth of a family. Babies come into the world in all different ways, and this is just one of the many factors. Inductions can be hard. They can be long. They can be frustrating. They can be awkward, and they can be tiring. But knowing how they happen and how we can set our clients up for success and how we can set ourselves up for success can make inductions way less daunting for the doula. I hope this has been helpful. If your doula is listening out there and you've got more ideas about inductions, please share them in the comments so that other people can learn from your experience as well. Thanks for being here. See you next week.